January 12, 2026, Rocky Hill, Connecticut. On the day her arrest became public, the case that had quietly moved through investigators' hands for nearly 3 years finally broke into the open. Karen Wurst, a 71-year-old staffing agency owner, was taken into custody and charged in a sweeping Connecticut Medicaid fraud case that stunned families, regulators, and healthcare providers across the state. Prosecutors alleged that Wurst knowingly sent an unlicensed caregiver into medical settings by disguising her as a licensed nurse, billing Medicaid for services that should never have been approved, and putting vulnerable residents at risk. By the time Wurst stood before a judge, officials said the alleged fraud had already cost the state more than $150,000 and contributed to a tragedy that could not be undone. That arrest marked the present moment of the case, but to understand how it happened, investigators say you have to move backward through a trail of false credentials, overlooked warning signs, and a system stretched thin by staffing shortages. As court proceedings began in Hartford's Superior Court, state prosecutors outlined what they described as a deliberate and sustained scheme. According to charging documents, Wurst was the owner and operator of NurseSpan LLC, a healthcare staffing agency based in West Hartford, Connecticut, though she herself lived in Raleigh, North Carolina. NurseSpan's business model was simple: supply nurses and caregivers to group homes and facilities serving adults with developmental and physical disabilities, many of whom relied on Connecticut's Medicaid program to fund their care. The problem, prosecutors said, was not staffing itself. It was who Wurst allegedly sent into those roles. At the center of the case was Suzanne Langen, a 48-year-old woman from Manchester, Connecticut. Langen worked at numerous facilities between June 2022 and March 2023, performing duties that legally required a valid nursing license. These duties included overseeing feeding tubes, administering medications, and responding to medical emergencies. To facility administrators, Langen appeared fully qualified. Her paperwork showed her as a licensed practical nurse, complete with a valid nursing license number. Investigators later discovered that license did not belong to her. According to the state, Wurst had taken the nursing license information of another woman, a nurse who had retired years earlier, and used that information without permission. Prosecutors alleged that Wurst copied the retired nurse's license number and attached it to Langen's employment records. On paper, it made Langen look legitimate. In reality, investigators say, she had never attended nursing school, never completed clinical training, and never passed a nursing exam in Connecticut or any other state. The retired nurse whose license was used had no involvement with NurseSpan and had not authorized her information to be shared. Investigators described this as a clear case of identity misuse, one that allowed Medicaid billing systems and facility administrators to accept Langen as a licensed professional without raising immediate red flags. With that false documentation in place, NurseSpan submitted claims to Medicaid for nursing-level services. Between mid-2022 and early 2023, those claims added up quickly. By late 2025, financial analysts working with the Connecticut Medicaid Fraud Control Unit had calculated that NurseSpan billed approximately $133,000 for services provided by Langen at least 18 different facilities across the state. An additional $19,000 in unbilled claims was later identified, pushing the total alleged fraud past $150,000. Each claim relied on the same core assumption, that Langen was a licensed nurse. Prosecutors said Wurst personally oversaw staffing placements and approved documentation. They alleged that she knew Langen lacked proper credentials and chose to use the retired nurse's information anyway. In doing so, they argued, Wurst bypassed safeguards designed to protect both patients and public funds. As the case moved through the courts, Wurst was released on a $75,000 bond, while Langen was released on two $50,000 bonds. Both women pleaded not guilty, and their attorneys emphasized that the legal process was ongoing. But by that point, the state's narrative was already clear. This was not an isolated paperwork error. It was, they said, a pattern. The event that brought everything to light occurred in March 2023 at an Oak Hill group home in Middletown, Connecticut. On that day, a resident with significant medical needs required care involving a gastrostomy feeding tube. Feeding tubes require careful monitoring and training, especially for residents who cannot advocate for themselves. Langen was working that shift as a nurse. According to police reports and witness statements, the resident began choking and vomiting shortly after the feeding tube was adjusted. The signs of medical distress were obvious. Despite this, emergency services were not called for approximately 45 minutes. By the time help arrived, the resident's condition had worsened beyond recovery. He later unalived. Initially, the incident was reviewed as a medical emergency with tragic consequences, but as administrators and investigators looked closer, inconsistencies began to emerge. When officials attempted to verify Langen's nursing license through the Connecticut Department of Public Health, they found no record of her name. That discovery changed everything. In the weeks following the Middletown incident, Middletown police launched a criminal investigation, while Oak Hill conducted an internal review. The focus quickly shifted from a single medical event to the broader question of how an unlicensed person could have been placed in such a critical role. Investigators learned that Oak Hill, like many facilities, relied heavily on staffing agencies to verify credentials. NurseSpan had provided paperwork that appeared complete and valid. No one at the facility independently checked the license number against the state's public database. Officials later acknowledged that a simple online lookup could have revealed the truth in minutes. Once the lack of licensure was confirmed, the case was referred to the Connecticut Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, which expanded the investigation statewide. Subpoenas were issued for billing records, emails, contracts, and employment files. Investigators also contacted the retired nurse whose license information had been used, confirming she had no connection to Langen or NurseSpan. As the investigation widened, it became clear that the Middletown incident was not an isolated placement. Langen had worked at multiple group homes across Connecticut, often assigned to overnight or weekend shifts when staffing shortages were most severe. In those settings, oversight was sometimes limited and reliance on agency documentation was high. Prosecutors said this environment allowed the alleged scheme to continue unchecked for months. Further complicating the case was Wurst's own professional background. Records showed that she once held a nursing license herself, but that license had expired years earlier. Investigators allege that despite her experience in healthcare, she failed to follow basic verification standards and instead chose to falsify records to keep contracts filled and revenue flowing. By mid-2024, the state believed it had enough evidence to bring formal charges. Langen was charged with multiple offenses, including health insurance fraud, identity theft, and first-degree assault of a disabled person related to the Middletown incident. Prosecutors argued that her lack of training directly contributed to the resident's medical crisis and ultimate unaliving. Wurst faced a longer list of charges, including larceny, conspiracy, healthcare fraud, and violations of professional licensing laws. Prosecutors emphasized her role as the organizer of the alleged scheme, stating that without her actions, Langen would never have been placed in these roles. The arrests sent shockwaves through the disability care community. Families of residents began asking whether their loved ones had been cared for by properly licensed staff. Advocacy groups demanded stronger oversight and accountability. State officials responded by announcing reviews of credential verification procedures for Medicaid-funded facilities. The Connecticut Department of Developmental Services acknowledged that while facilities are responsible for daily operations, staffing agencies play a critical role in ensuring qualifications are legitimate. Lawmakers also raised concerns about systemic vulnerabilities. Medicaid billing systems, they noted, rely heavily on the honesty of providers. While audits exist, they are often retrospective, meaning problems may not be detected until after harm has occurred. For investigators, the case highlighted how quickly trust can be exploited when systems are under pressure. Looking further back, NurseSpan LLC had built a reputation as a reliable staffing source during a period of widespread healthcare worker shortages. Facilities facing staffing gaps often needed immediate coverage, and agencies that could supply workers quickly were in high demand. Investigators now say that urgency may have contributed to corners being cut. Emails reviewed by the state showed repeated assurances from NurseSpan that staff were fully licensed. Those assurances, prosecutors allege, were knowingly false in Langen's case. As the legal process moved forward in late 2025, expert medical reviewers consulted by the state concluded that proper emergency response during the March 2023 incident could have altered the outcome. While no one could say with certainty what would have happened, they agreed the care provided fell below accepted standards. For the family of the resident who unalived, the case was never about money or headlines. In statements shared through advocates, they said they hoped accountability would prevent similar situations in the future. Disability rights groups echoed that sentiment, emphasizing that people who rely on caregivers are especially vulnerable to systemic failures. As of early 2026, both Wurst and Langen remained awaiting trial. Prosecutors indicated they were prepared to present extensive documentation and witness testimony, while defense attorneys continued to challenge the state's interpretation of events. Regardless of the final verdicts, the case has already left a lasting mark on Connecticut's healthcare system. It exposed weaknesses in credential verification, reliance on staffing agencies, and oversight of Medicaid-funded care. What began with an arrest on a cold January morning ultimately traced back through years of missed checks, falsified records, and misplaced trust. And at the center of it all was a simple question that investigators say should have been asked from the start. Who was really qualified to care for those who could not protect themselves? Thank you for watching. Stories like this raise difficult questions about trust, oversight, and accountability in healthcare. What do you think about what happened here? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown useful, please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss future updates.